Sometimes the most ordinary day can become the most extraordinary moment of your life. In the summer of 1995, a simple mason from Chicago accepted what seemed like a routine renovation job in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. What David Parker discovered behind a seemingly innocent wall would not only change his life forever, but would reopen one of the darkest chapters in human history. This is the true story of secrets that powerful people killed to hide, evidence that the FBI thought was lost forever, and the courage of one man who refused to let the truth remain buried. Chapter 1. David Parker was born in 1958 in the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the smell of the stockyards mixed with the dreams of immigrant families who had come to America seeking a better life. His father, Thomas Parker, was a second-generation Irish immigrant who had learned the masonry trade from his own father, and by the time David was old enough to hold a trowel, he was already learning the ancient art of working with stone and mortar. The Parker family lived in a modest two-bedroom house on Ashland Avenue, where the sound of the elevated train provided a constant soundtrack to daily life. Thomas Parker was a man of few words but strong principles, who believed that honest work and attention to detail were the keys to success in America. He taught David that every brick placed correctly was a step toward building something permanent and meaningful, something that would outlast the man who built it. By the time David graduated from high school in 1976, he had already decided that college wasn't for him. While his classmates were filling out applications for universities, David was learning the family trade, working alongside his father on construction sites throughout Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. The work was hard, physical, and demanding, but David found satisfaction in creating something tangible with his hands, something that would still be standing long after he was gone. David married his high school sweetheart Jennifer Walsh in 1982, and they settled into a quiet life in the Bridgeport neighborhood. Jennifer worked as a secretary at a law firm downtown, while David built his reputation as one of the most skilled and reliable masons in the city. By 1990, Parker Masonry had become a small but respected company, specializing in historic preservation and high-end residential work. David's reputation for quality work and absolute discretion made him a favorite among Chicago's wealthy elite, who often hired him to work on properties where privacy and confidentiality were as important as craftsmanship. He had worked on the homes of judges, politicians, business leaders, and celebrities, always maintaining the professional silence that wealthy clients valued above all else. It was this reputation that brought him to the attention of Margaret Hoffman in June 1995. Mrs. Hoffman was a well-dressed woman in her 70s who spoke with a slight German accent and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and authority. She had inherited a large mansion in Lincoln Park from her late husband's family, and after years of neglect, she had decided to renovate the property before selling it. The Hoffman Mansion was an impressive three-story Victorian structure built in 1892, with elaborate stonework, tall windows, and the kind of architectural details that spoke of an era when wealthy families built homes to last for generations. The house had been empty for nearly 15 years, and it showed every day of that neglect. Paint was peeling from the walls, several windows were broken, and the entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of time and abandonment. "Mr. Parker," Mrs. Hoffman said as they walked through the dusty, dimly lit rooms, "this house has been in my husband's family since it was built. Heinrich, my late husband, passed away in 1979, and I've been unable to bring myself to deal with the property until now. But it's time. I'm getting too old to maintain it, and it deserves to be restored to its former glory." David nodded, making notes on his clipboard as they toured the mansion. The masonry work would be extensive. Several of the stone walls showed signs of water damage, and some of the mortar between the bricks had deteriorated so badly that entire sections would need to be rebuilt. It was exactly the kind of challenging, high-quality work that David specialized in. "There's one room in particular that I'd like you to focus on," Mrs. Hoffman said, leading David to a study on the second floor. "This was my husband's private office, and there's been some kind of water damage to the interior wall. I'd like you to tear out the damaged section and rebuild it properly." The study was a masculine room with dark wood paneling, built-in bookshelves, and a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall, but David's attention was immediately drawn to a section of the interior wall where the plaster had cracked and water stains were visible. The damage looked recent, possibly caused by a leaking pipe in the wall, but there was something about the pattern of the cracks that struck David as unusual. "Mrs. Hoffman," David said, running his hand along the damaged wall, "this water damage looks like it might go deeper than just the surface. I'm going to need to remove quite a bit of the wall to properly assess the structural damage and make sure there's no mold or rot behind the plaster." Mrs. Hoffman's expression seemed to tighten slightly, but she nodded. "Do whatever is necessary, Mr. Parker. I want the job done correctly, regardless of the cost." David gave her an estimate for the work that included complete removal and rebuilding of the damaged wall section, and Mrs. Hoffman accepted without negotiation. She gave him a key to the house and told him she would be traveling to Europe for the next month, leaving him free to work at his own pace without supervision. It was exactly the kind of job David preferred. Challenging work, good pay, and a client who trusted him to do the job right, without constant oversight. He had no way of knowing that accepting this particular job would soon put his life in danger and force him to confront secrets that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep buried. David began work on the Hoffman mansion on Monday, July 10th, 1995. The first week was routine, removing damaged plaster, assessing the underlying structure, and preparing the wall for reconstruction. But as David worked deeper into the wall, he began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. The construction behind the plaster wasn't typical for a house built in 1892. There was a section of newer brickwork that appeared to have been added sometime in the 1940s, creating what looked like a false wall about 6 inches in front of the original structure. The workmanship was professional, but it was clearly designed to conceal something rather than to provide structural support. On Friday afternoon of his first week on the job, David was using a sledgehammer to remove a particularly stubborn section of the false wall when he heard a hollow sound that indicated empty space behind the bricks. After carefully removing several more bricks, David found himself looking into a hidden compartment that had been sealed for over 50 years. The compartment was about 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, and 2 feet deep, large enough to hide a considerable amount of material, and as David shined his flashlight into the darkness, what he saw made his hands start shaking and his heart begin to race. The hidden space was filled with wooden crates, metal boxes, and stacks of documents wrapped in oilcloth. But what caught David's attention immediately were the symbols visible on some of the containers. Symbols that any American who had lived through World War II would recognize instantly. Nazi eagles, swastikas, and German text that David couldn't read, but that sent a chill down his spine. David Parker had stumbled onto something that Heinrich Hoffmann had hidden away in 1945, and that someone had been willing to kill to keep secret ever since. Chapter 2. David Parker stood frozen in the dusty study of the Hoffman mansion, his flashlight beam illuminating symbols and artifacts that belonged in a museum dedicated to one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Nazi emblems seemed to stare back at him from the hidden compartment, and for several minutes David couldn't bring himself to move or even breathe normally. His first instinct was to call the police, but something held him back. Mrs. Hoffman had trusted him with her family's property, and David's professional reputation was built on discretion and confidentiality. Before he involved law enforcement, he needed to understand exactly what he had discovered and what it might mean for his client. David carefully began removing items from the hidden compartment, laying them out on the dust-covered floor of the study. What he found was more disturbing and more valuable than anything he could have imagined. The first crate contained stacks of German documents, all bearing official Nazi letterhead and stamps. David couldn't read German, but he recognized dates from the 1940s and what appeared to be official signatures and seals. The papers were wrapped in oilcloth and were in remarkably good condition, as if someone had taken great care to preserve them for posterity. The second container was a metal strongbox that required a crowbar to open. Inside, David found something that made his hands shake so violently he nearly dropped his flashlight. Gold bars, each one stamped with Nazi eagles and German text, each one small enough to fit in a man's hand, but heavy enough to represent more wealth than David had ever seen in one place. But it was the third container that contained the most shocking discovery of all. Inside a leather portfolio, David found photographs, identification documents, and what appeared to be travel papers for Heinrich Hoffmann. But these weren't the documents of an ordinary German immigrant who had come to America seeking a new life after the war. According to the papers David found, Heinrich Hoffmann had been SS Oberführer Heinrich Hoffmann, a high-ranking Nazi official who had been responsible for the confiscation of Jewish property in occupied Poland. The documents detailed the systematic theft of gold, jewelry, artwork, and other valuables from Jewish families who were being deported to concentration camps. David found detailed inventories, written in meticulous German script, listing thousands of items that had been stolen. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, religious artifacts, and personal treasures that represented the entire life savings of families who would never live to reclaim them. Next to each item was a notation indicating where it had been sent or sold, creating a paper trail of theft that stretched across Europe. But the most chilling documents were the photographs. Black and white images that showed Heinrich Hoffmann in full Nazi uniform, standing beside other SS officers, overseeing the loading of trucks filled with stolen property. In some of the photographs, David could see Jewish families in the background, being herded toward trains that would take them to their deaths. As David studied the photographs more closely, he realized that some of the gold bars he had found matched items shown in the inventories. Heinrich Hoffmann hadn't just stolen these treasures for the Nazi regime, he had stolen some of them for himself, hiding them away as insurance for a future that even he must have known would eventually require him to flee Germany. The final container held the most personal and most damning evidence of all, Heinrich Hoffmann's diary, written in German but containing enough English phrases and recognizable names that David could understand the basic content. The diary chronicled Hoffmann's journey from Germany to Chicago in 1946, describing how he had used stolen identity papers to enter the United States, and how he had used stolen Nazi gold to establish himself as a respected businessman in Chicago. But the diary also contained information that made David's blood run cold. Heinrich Hoffmann hadn't worked alone. The diary mentioned other Nazi war criminals who had escaped to America, and it suggested that there was an entire network of former SS officers who had settled in cities across the United States, using stolen Jewish wealth to build new lives while the families they had robbed lay dead in mass graves across Europe. As David sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by evidence of crimes that defied human comprehension, he faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could carefully replace everything in the hidden compartment, finish his masonry work, and pretend he had never seen any of it. Heinrich Hoffmann was dead, the war was over, and the crimes documented in these papers had happened 50 years ago. Or he could contact the authorities and set in motion a chain of events that would bring justice for crimes that had never been prosecuted and restore stolen wealth to the families who had been robbed of everything they owned. David thought about his own family, about his Irish immigrant grandparents who had come to America seeking opportunity and freedom. He thought about the Jewish families whose treasures were hidden in this room. Families who had been murdered for the crime of being born into the wrong religion, in the wrong place at the wrong time. There really wasn't a choice to be made. David carefully photographed each document, each gold bar, and each piece of evidence, using a camera he had in his truck for documenting his masonry work. He made detailed notes about exactly where each item had been found and how the hidden compartment had been constructed. Then he carefully replaced everything exactly as he had found it and sealed up the compartment temporarily with loose bricks. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table with Jennifer, showing her the photographs he had taken and explaining what he had discovered. Jennifer, who had worked for years in a law firm and understood the legal implications of what David had found, was as shocked as her husband. "David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't just about stolen property. This is evidence of war crimes. There are probably families all over the world who have been looking for these items for 50 years, families who never knew what happened to their grandparents' wedding rings or their family's religious artifacts." "I know," David said, "but I also know that when I call the FBI tomorrow, I'm going to be starting something that I can't stop. Mrs. Hoffman trusted me with her family's property, and I'm about to destroy her family's name and probably put her in prison." Jennifer was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs spread across their kitchen table. Finally, she looked up at her husband with tears in her eyes. "David, Mrs. Hoffman's family name was destroyed 50 years ago when Heinrich Hoffmann decided to become a Nazi war criminal. You didn't create this situation. You just discovered it. Those families who were robbed and murdered deserve justice, even if it comes 50 years too late." The next morning, David Parker called the FBI. "What do you think about David's discovery? Would you have had the courage to contact the authorities, knowing that it would destroy an elderly woman's life and possibly put your own family in danger? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in David's situation." Chapter 3. The FBI took David Parker's phone call very seriously. Within 6 hours of his initial contact with the Bureau, 2 federal agents were sitting in the study of the Hoffman mansion, staring into the hidden compartment that David had reopened for their inspection. Special Agent Patricia Sullivan was a specialist in art recovery and international crimes, while Special Agent Michael Torres had spent his entire career investigating white-collar crime and financial fraud. Agent Sullivan examined the Nazi documents with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar materials before, while Agent Torres focused on the gold bars and what appeared to be detailed financial records hidden among the papers. Both agents quickly realized that David had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple case of stolen property. "Mr. Parker," Agent Sullivan said, carefully photographing each document in the hidden compartment, "what you've discovered here is potentially one of the most important finds related to Nazi war crimes that we've seen in decades. These documents don't just show individual theft. They appear to document an entire systematic operation for stealing Jewish wealth and moving it out of Europe." Agent Torres was examining the gold bars with a jeweler's loupe, studying the Nazi markings and serial numbers that had been stamped into each piece. These gold bars appear to be part of a shipment that the U.S. Army reported as missing in 1945. "We've been looking for this gold for 50 years, and here it is, hidden in a house in Chicago." David watched the 2 agents work, feeling a mixture of vindication and growing concern. He had done the right thing by calling the FBI, but he was beginning to understand that his discovery was going to have consequences that reached far beyond the Hoffman mansion. Agents, David said. I need to ask you something important. Mrs. Hoffman is an elderly woman who hired me to do renovation work on this house. As far as I know, she has no idea that any of this material was hidden here. What's going to happen to her? Agent Sullivan looked up from the documents she was examining. Mr. Parker, that's going to depend on what our investigation reveals about Mrs. Hoffman's knowledge of these materials and her role, if any, in concealing them. But I have to tell you that concealing evidence of war crimes is a federal offense, regardless of when the crimes were committed. The investigation that followed was unlike anything David had ever experienced. FBI agents swarmed the Hoffman mansion, carefully documenting and removing every piece of evidence from the hidden compartment. The house was declared a federal crime scene, and David's simple renovation project became part of one of the most complex international investigations in FBI history. But the real shock came 3 days later when Agent Sullivan called David with news that changed everything. Mr. Parker, we've had the documents you found analyzed by our German language specialists and our experts in Nazi documentation. What you discovered isn't just evidence of war crimes. It's evidence of ongoing crimes that are still being committed today. David met with the agents at the FBI's Chicago field office, where they spread out copies of the documents on a conference room table. Agent Torres pointed to several pages of financial records that had been hidden with the Nazi materials. These financial documents show that Heinrich Hoffmann didn't just steal Jewish wealth during the war, Agent Torres explained. He continued to profit from those thefts for the rest of his life. The gold you found was just a small part of a much larger fortune that Hoffmann invested in legitimate businesses throughout the United States. Agent Sullivan added, according to these records, Hoffmann used stolen Nazi gold to purchase real estate, invest in the stock market, and start several businesses in Chicago. Those investments have been generating income for over 50 years, and that income has been flowing to Heinrich Hoffmann's heirs. David stared at the documents, trying to process the implications of what the agents were telling him. You're saying that Mrs. Hoffman has been living off money that was stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. That's exactly what we're saying, Agent Sullivan confirmed. And based on these financial records, we estimate that the total value of the stolen assets, including 50 years of investment growth, could be worth over $40 million in today's money. But the investigation was about to take an even more disturbing turn. As FBI agents began tracing the financial records and following the money trail that Heinrich Hoffmann had created, they discovered that he hadn't been working alone. The documents David had found contained references to other Nazi war criminals who had escaped to the United States after the war, and those references included names, addresses, and details about a network of former SS officers who had been living in American cities for decades. Mr. Parker, Agent Torres said during their fourth meeting, we need you to understand that what you've discovered has implications that go far beyond the Hoffmann case. We believe we're looking at evidence of an organized conspiracy to help Nazi war criminals escape justice and establish new lives in the United States. The scope of the investigation expanded rapidly. FBI officers in 12 different cities began investigating other former Nazi officials who were mentioned in Heinrich Hoffmann's documents. Some had died years earlier, but others were still alive, still living comfortable lives funded by wealth they had stolen from Holocaust victims. It was during this expanded investigation that David began receiving the phone calls. The first call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night, waking David and Jennifer from a sound sleep. The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and spoke with a slight German accent. Mr. Parker, you have discovered things that were meant to remain hidden. Continuing to cooperate with the FBI investigation would be unwise. Consider this friendly advice. The line went dead, leaving David staring at the phone with his heart pounding. Jennifer was awake now, and the fear in her eyes reflected David's own growing realization that his discovery had put his family in danger. The second call came 2 days later, this time to David's work phone at a construction site. "Mr. Parker, accidents happen every day in your line of work. Men fall from scaffolding, heavy equipment malfunctions, walls collapse. It would be unfortunate if something were to happen to you before you could finish your cooperation with the federal government." David immediately contacted Agent Sullivan and reported the threatening phone calls. The FBI response was swift and comprehensive. Federal agents began monitoring David's phone calls, providing security for his family, and treating the threats as evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Parker," Agent Sullivan explained, "these threats suggest that there are people still alive who have a vested interest in keeping Heinrich Hoffmann's secrets buried. That means we're not just investigating historical crimes, we're investigating ongoing criminal activity." The threats escalated quickly. David's truck was vandalized while he was working at a construction site. Someone broke into his home while he and Jennifer were at work, but nothing was stolen. The break-in seemed designed to send a message that David's family wasn't safe anywhere. The final threat came in the form of a photograph slipped under David's front door. The photograph showed Jennifer leaving the law firm where she worked, taken from close range by someone who had obviously been following her. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Some secrets are worth killing for." That night, David and Jennifer sat in their kitchen under the protection of FBI agents, trying to decide whether to continue cooperating with the investigation or to withdraw and hope that the threats would stop. "David," Jennifer said, "I'm scared, but I keep thinking about those families who were murdered and how their children and grandchildren have spent 50 years wondering what happened to their family treasures. How can we stop now, when we might be the only people who can bring them justice?" David looked at his wife, understanding once again why he had fallen in love with her strength and her moral courage. "You're right. Heinrich Hoffmann and his friends thought they could hide their crimes forever. They thought that by murdering their victims and hiding the evidence, they could escape justice, but they were wrong. Thank you for staying with us this far in David's incredible and dangerous journey. Your engagement means everything to us, and we promise that the best and most shocking revelations are yet to come." What David and the FBI discovered next would not only solve 50-year-old war crimes, but would expose a conspiracy that was still active and still dangerous in 1995. Chapter 4. The breakthrough in the Heinrich Hoffmann investigation came from an unexpected source, a 93-year-old woman named Rachel Goldman who lived in a nursing home in Brooklyn, New York. Mrs. Goldman had survived the Holocaust and had spent 50 years searching for information about her family's fate and their stolen possessions. When news of David Parker's discovery reached the media, Mrs. Goldman contacted the FBI with information that would crack the case wide open. Mrs. Goldman had been 17 years old when Nazi forces occupied her hometown of Krakow, Poland in 1941. She had watched SS officers, including a man she remembered as Heinrich Hoffmann, systematically loot Jewish homes and businesses, taking everything from family heirlooms to children's toys. But Mrs. Goldman had something that no one else possessed. She had kept a detailed diary of everything she had witnessed, hidden it throughout the war, and brought it with her when she immigrated to America in 1947. Agent Sullivan, Mrs. Goldman said during their first meeting, her voice still strong despite her advanced age, "I have been waiting 50 years for someone to find Heinrich Hoffmann's stolen treasure. I can identify every piece of gold, every document, every photograph that was taken from my family and my neighbors." Mrs. Goldman's diary was a revelation. Written in careful Yiddish script, it contained detailed descriptions of the systematic theft that Heinrich Hoffmann had orchestrated, including specific mentions of gold bars, jewelry, religious artifacts, and family treasures that matched exactly what David had found in the hidden compartment. But Mrs. Goldman provided something even more valuable than identification of stolen property. She provided names and addresses of other Nazi officials who had worked with Heinrich Hoffmann, including several who she believed had also escaped to America after the war. There was Klaus Weber, who specialized in stealing artwork and rare books, Mrs. Goldman told the FBI agents. There was Franz Müller, who took over Jewish businesses and sold them to German investors. And there was Otto Brenner, who was in charge of melting down gold jewelry and converting it into bars that could be easily transported. FBI investigators quickly discovered that Klaus Weber had immigrated to America in 1947 and had established himself as a successful art dealer in New York City. Franz Müller had settled in Milwaukee, where he had built a manufacturing empire using capital that investigators now suspected had been stolen from Jewish businesses. Otto Brenner had moved to Los Angeles and had become a respected banker and philanthropist. All three men were still alive in 1995. All three were living comfortable lives funded by wealth they had stolen during the Holocaust. And all three had families who had no idea that their comfortable American lifestyle was built on the systematic murder and robbery of innocent people. But the investigation took an even more shocking turn when FBI codebreakers finally deciphered a series of encrypted messages that had been hidden among Heinrich Hoffmann's documents. The messages revealed that the Nazi war criminals who had escaped to America hadn't simply gone into hiding. They had maintained contact with each other and had continued to operate as an organized network for 50 years. The network, which the FBI codenamed Operation Bernhard after a Nazi counterfeiting scheme, had been systematically laundering stolen Nazi gold through legitimate American businesses, investing the proceeds in real estate and stock market investments, and using the profits to fund a comfortable lifestyle for dozens of former Nazi officials and their families. But the most shocking discovery was that Operation Bernhard was still active in 1995. The network had evolved from war criminals hiding from justice into a sophisticated financial conspiracy that was still moving money, still concealing evidence, and still eliminating threats to their security. Agent Torres showed David a series of financial records that painted a picture of ongoing criminal activity that stretched across the entire United States. Mr. Parker, what you discovered in that wall wasn't just historical evidence. It was the key to understanding an ongoing criminal enterprise that has been operating in this country for 50 years. The evidence showed that Heinrich Hoffmann's stolen gold had been the seed money for a network of investments that now included hotels, restaurants, manufacturing companies, and real estate developments in over 20 states. The network generated an estimated $50 million per year in income, which was distributed among the families of Nazi war criminals and used to fund continued criminal activities. But here's the most disturbing part, Agent Sullivan added. Our investigation has revealed that when network members die, their share of the stolen wealth doesn't go to their American-born children. It goes to a secret fund that is used to help other Nazi war criminals who are still in hiding around the world. The FBI had uncovered evidence that Operation Bernhard was still actively helping Nazi war criminals escape justice in 1995, providing false documents, financial support, and safe passage for aging SS officers who were facing prosecution in Europe for war crimes. David stared at the evidence spread across the conference room table, trying to process the implications of what he was learning. You're telling me that the renovation job I took led to the discovery of an active Nazi network that's still operating in America? That's exactly what we're telling you, Agent Torres confirmed, and that's why you and your family have been receiving death threats. The people behind those threats aren't just trying to protect Heinrich Hoffmann's reputation. They're trying to protect an ongoing criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The investigation had identified 12 Nazi war criminals who were still alive and living in the United States in 1995, all of whom had been receiving income from investments made with stolen Holocaust wealth. The network included not just the original war criminals, but also their American-born children and grandchildren, some of whom had knowingly participated in the conspiracy, while others had been kept in the dark about the source of their family's wealth. But Operation Bernhard's influence reached even further than the FBI had initially suspected. The investigation revealed that the network had used its wealth and influence to corrupt government officials, law enforcement officers, and business leaders who had helped protect the conspiracy for decades. "Mr. Parker," Agent Sullivan said, "we now understand why your initial contacts with the FBI were met with delays and why some of our own agents seemed reluctant to pursue this investigation aggressively. Operation Bernhard has had 50 years to place people in positions where they could protect the network from exactly the kind of discovery you made." The full scope of the corruption was staggering. The FBI investigation revealed that Operation Bernhard had been paying bribes to Immigration and Naturalization Service officials who helped network members obtain false documents and conceal their true identities. They had corrupted bank officials who helped launder stolen money and avoid federal reporting requirements. They had even infiltrated the FBI itself, placing agents in positions where they could sabotage investigations that threatened the network. David realized that his decision to contact the FBI had done more than expose historical war crimes. It had uncovered ongoing treason and corruption that threatened the integrity of the American justice system itself. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. As FBI investigators traced the financial records found in Heinrich Hoffmann's hidden compartment, they discovered that the stolen Nazi gold was just the beginning of Operation Bernhard's criminal activities. The network had been engaged in arms trafficking, drug smuggling, and international money laundering for decades, using their legitimate businesses as fronts for criminal activities that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. They had sold weapons to international terrorists, smuggled narcotics into American cities, and laundered money for organized crime syndicates around the world. Heinrich Hoffmann hadn't just been a Nazi war criminal who had escaped justice. He had been the founder of one of the most sophisticated and dangerous criminal organizations in American history. And David Parker, the simple mason from Chicago, who had just wanted to do a good job renovating an old house, had accidentally discovered the key to bringing down the entire operation. Now, Chapter 5. 18 months after David Parker broke open that false wall in the Hoffman mansion, he stood in Federal Courtroom 12B in Chicago, watching as the last of 12 Nazi war criminals was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal agents, and Holocaust survivors who had traveled from around the world to witness a moment of justice that many had thought would never come. The path from David's shocking discovery to this moment of historical reckoning had been filled with danger, international intrigue, and revelations that had rewritten the history of Nazi war crimes in America. What had started as a simple masonry job had become the largest Nazi war crimes investigation in U.S. history and had exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American society. The investigation that followed David's initial discovery had expanded to involve not just the FBI, but also the CIA, Interpol, and law enforcement agencies in 12 different countries. Operation Bernhard, as the FBI had codenamed the Nazi network, had tentacles that reached across 4 continents and had been operating continuously for over 50 years. Klaus Weber, the art dealer from New York, had been revealed as the network's coordinator for stolen cultural artifacts. His Manhattan gallery had been a front for laundering stolen artwork worth over $200 million, pieces that had been looted from Jewish families and European museums during the war. When FBI agents raided his gallery, they found paintings by Picasso, Van Gogh, and Monet that had been reported missing since 1943. Franz Müller, the Milwaukee manufacturer, had been using his factories to produce weapons and equipment that were sold to international criminal organizations and terrorist groups. His seemingly legitimate manufacturing empire had been supplying arms to conflicts around the world while generating enormous profits that were funneled back into the Nazi network. Otto Brenner, the Los Angeles banker, had been the financial mastermind behind the entire operation. His bank had been laundering money for organized crime syndicates, drug cartels, and international arms dealers, while maintaining the appearance of a respectable financial institution. Federal investigators discovered that Brenner's bank had processed over $3 billion in illegal transactions over the past 20 years. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators traced the network's connections to mainstream American politics and business. Operation Bernhard had been making political contributions, bribing government officials and corrupting law enforcement for decades, ensuring that their criminal activities would be protected from investigation. The conspiracy had reached into the halls of Congress, where 3 sitting representatives had received substantial campaign contributions from businesses that were fronts for the Nazi network. 2 federal judges had been receiving bribes to ensure favorable rulings in cases that might have exposed the conspiracy. Even the FBI itself had been infiltrated, with 4 agents discovered to be on the network's payroll. David's role in exposing this massive conspiracy had made him both a hero and a target. The death threats had continued throughout the investigation, escalating to the point where David and Jennifer had been forced to enter the Federal Witness Protection Program for 6 months, while the most dangerous network members were arrested and prosecuted. But David had also become something he had never expected to be, a symbol of hope for Holocaust survivors and their families around the world. As news of his discovery spread internationally, hundreds of families came forward with information about their own stolen treasures, many of which were recovered during the FBI's raids on Operation Bernhard's facilities. Mrs. Rachel Goldman, the Brooklyn nursing home resident whose diary had helped crack the case, had lived to see the return of her family's stolen religious artifacts, including a silver menorah that had been passed down through 7 generations before the Nazis stole it. At the trial, she testified that seeing David's courage in exposing the truth had given her faith that justice could still be served, even 50 years after the crimes were committed. "Mr. Parker," she said during her testimony, "you gave me something I thought I would never have, the knowledge that my family's murderers did not escape justice forever. You proved that no matter how long criminals hide, no matter how powerful they become, the truth will eventually find a way to the surface." The financial restitution from the investigation was staggering. Federal courts ordered the seizure of assets worth over $800 million, money that had been stolen from Holocaust victims and invested in legitimate businesses for 50 years. The seized assets were distributed to Holocaust survivor organizations, Jewish museums, and the families of victims who could prove their connection to the stolen property. David himself received a substantial reward from the FBI for his role in exposing the conspiracy, but he used most of the money to establish a foundation dedicated to helping Holocaust survivors find information about their lost family members and stolen property. The David Parker Foundation now operates in 12 countries and has helped recover stolen artifacts worth over $50 million. But perhaps the most important outcome of David's discovery was its impact on how America dealt with the legacy of Nazi war crimes. The investigation revealed that the U.S. government had been far too lenient in its efforts to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals who had escaped to America after the war. Congressional hearings that followed the trials led to the establishment of a permanent federal task force dedicated to finding and prosecuting Nazi war criminals and their collaborators. The task force has since identified over 40 additional war criminals living in the United States and has initiated deportation proceedings against all of them. The investigation also led to major reforms in how the FBI handles cases involving international war crimes and organized crime conspiracies. New protocols were established to prevent the kind of corruption that had allowed Operation Bernhard to operate for so long, and federal agents now receive specialized training in recognizing and investigating international criminal networks. For David Parker himself, the experience fundamentally changed his understanding of his place in the world and his responsibility to his fellow human beings. He returned to his masonry work, but he also became a sought-after speaker at Holocaust museums, law enforcement conferences, and human rights organizations around the world. "I was just trying to do a good job fixing a wall," David often tells audiences. "I never expected to uncover one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history. But what I learned is that ordinary people have a responsibility to speak up when they discover evidence of injustice, no matter how powerful the people involved might be." Jennifer Parker returned to her work at the law firm, but also became active in organizations dedicated to Holocaust education and the prevention of genocide. "What David discovered taught us that evil doesn't just disappear when a war ends," she says. "It adapts, it hides, and it waits for people to forget. Our job is to make sure that never happens." Today, the Hoffman Mansion stands empty, sealed by federal court order as a historical crime scene. Plans are underway to convert it into a museum dedicated to educating people about the Holocaust and the importance of pursuing justice for war crimes, no matter how much time has passed. Heinrich Hoffmann's hidden compartment has been preserved exactly as David found it, serving as a reminder that the most ordinary moments can sometimes reveal the most extraordinary truths. Visitors to the future museum will be able to see the false wall that concealed 50 years of secrets and understand how one man's commitment to doing his job properly led to justice for thousands of victims of one of history's greatest crimes. Margaret Hoffman, Heinrich's widow, died of a heart attack 3 days after FBI agents arrested her for conspiracy to conceal evidence of war crimes. Federal investigators determined that she had known about the hidden compartment and its contents for decades, but had been too frightened of her husband's former associates to reveal the truth. Her death meant that some secrets about Operation Bernhard died with her, but her cooperation in the final weeks of her life helped federal agents locate additional evidence that led to the prosecution of several network members. David Parker's story serves as a reminder that history is not something that happened in the past and was forgotten. The crimes of the Holocaust continued to cause pain and injustice for 50 years after the war ended, and it took the courage of one honest construction worker to begin the process of bringing closure to families who had been searching for answers for half a century. His story also proves that justice has no expiration date. The Nazi war criminals, who thought they had escaped to comfortable retirements in America, learned that their crimes would eventually catch up with them, no matter how long they hid or how much wealth they accumulated. Most importantly, David Parker's story shows that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they choose to do what's right instead of what's convenient. He could have ignored what he found behind that wall, finished his renovation job, and gone home to his quiet life in Chicago. Instead, he chose to risk his safety, his career, and his family's security to ensure that justice would finally be served. Sometimes, the most heroic thing a person can do is simply refuse to look the other way when they encounter evidence of injustice. David Parker proved that when ordinary people find the courage to speak truth to power, even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies can be brought to justice. What would you have done if you had discovered evidence of such massive crimes hidden in a wall you were hired to repair? Would you have had the courage to risk everything to ensure that justice was served, even 50 years after the original crimes were committed? Would you have been willing to put your family in danger to help families you had never met find closure for tragedies that had happened before you were born? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and justice moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the pursuit of truth and justice. And don't forget to watch our next recommended video about the last 24 hours of a Mason who knew too much and paid the ultimate price for his knowledge. You won't believe what he discovered and how far powerful people were willing to go to keep their secrets buried.